Okay, so we're going to go through and just have a quick run through of the time collection module system integrated with Serenic. The first step in the presentation will be go to the web browser and scan our badge to log in. Normally this is done with the barcode scanner, but for this we're just going to enter the code via the keyboard and hope that it logs us in. Okay, so once I've scanned in badge, it brings up a dispatch list for this particular user. That's configurable. We can show the dispatch list to start, or we can show the actual time card to start. In addition, this is the dispatch list for put orders. We can also show the dispatch list for jobs instead. If you're using the barcode scanner, at any point you could just scan barcode and it will react and generate an entry on the time card. Without the barcode scanner, if you're using a tablet or a mouse and a keyboard, you can select a production order or a job to begin work on, and you can clock on to that particular activity. In this case, it's an operation. As soon as we do that, it shows us the time card entry that it creates for that production order and that operation and everything else. Had I scanned the barcode, I'd get exactly the same view. Now, when I come in here and operate this, I have two modes that I can enter time in. One is I can just manually enter some time in here, or I can have it set up so that it clocks on and clocks off. So for example, if I've clocked onto this job for a while, and I either scan the barcode for a new production order or scan the barcode for this production order, it will clock me off that particular production order and automatically calculate the elapsed time. You have the option of recording time in hours, minutes, or days. In this case, it's set up to record time in hours. So if I actually clock off this particular job, we should see a very small number of hours recorded for that particular activity. The way I have it set up, I can also manually enter time. So if I wanted to override that, enter 2 hours of time, I can do that here as well. As far as this particular operation, I can go in and I can enter the consumption for this particular operation or the output. And I have the ability to show things like quality measures, document links, and tooling. In the case of quality measures, if any were defined, I'd be able to go in there, click on this record button, and record the quality measures for this particular operation. That's effectively it for production orders. We can also record time against fixed assets, non-productive time, rework time, jobs, and on jobs we can go down to the planning line level. So if you have a schedule line on your planning lines on the jobs, we can actually record actual time against that planning line. We can also record time against service orders and assembly orders. That's a future capability that's coming, but it's in the works right now. When the user is done entering time, again, with a barcode scanner, they would just scan the barcode. Otherwise, they could come back into the dispatch list, choose another item to work on, and clock on to that item. You notice we can also do assignments. So if an employee wants to actually assign work to himself, he can select a particular operation and take that operation, and it adds it to his per dispatch list. You notice that the operation, it's fairly easy to read here, but if you want to see more detail about the actual operation number and all those sort of things, there are a lot of calls that are available that we can make visible so that we can see what's going on in this particular dispatch list. That's the net effect of entering time. As I'm entering time here, what's happening is directly in NAV, it's creating the time card line and the time card forming. So if I jump into NAV, I'll see this particular entry for this user's time card. So that's Mark Hansen. And on this production order, I'll be able to see that he's clocked into it and how much unapproved and unposted time is associated with that operation. So in real time, I can see what's happening on the production. The other thing we can see down here at the bottom, it says shift start. So that's the time I actually clocked in for the day on this particular time card. So what that allows us to do is track attendance verification. So we know when people clock in, we know when they clock out, and we can calculate the elapsed time between those two and use that for attendance verification. So we can determine whether they're, at work on time, whether they left early, those types of things. And that is used with the payroll integration in some cases to determine how much people get paid per day. As far as approvals go, we can do approvals from within the web browser as well if we use the nav approval web client. So here I am still in the browser, and we get some time cards that are in here. To approve these, what I would do, because depending on the user you're logged in as, you would only see the time cards for the people that report to you. So when I run through this, I'll only see the people that report to me. And what I can do is on each time card, I can validate that time card. If there's any errors, it'll let me there as to what the errors are. And you'll notice here we've got production orders and fixed assets in the same time card. It tells us our total time associated with that particular time card. And if I want to, I can click this and mark it as approved and then move to the next time card I need to approve. To do that, just click next, and we can work our way through all the time cards. You'll notice here's the one that I just created. It's marked as open, which means it's currently active. It hasn't been, he hasn't reached the end of his shift, so his time card is still open and active. And there's the time I entered. I entered that production order number, that operation number, and 2 hours of run time on that particular entry. Okay. So approvals from the browser fairly simple. The approving user would just click approve. You'd move to the next time card. This is the last one on the list, and go through and approve all the time cards that are no longer open and ready to be approved. When we jump into NAV from this point, so what I'll do is I'll just open up the TCM role center. So this is the approval center, where I've got, I know exactly how many time cards are in progress, how many are not approved, so they've been entered, they're no longer active, but they haven't been approved yet, and how many time cards are approved. We have some alerts. We have a couple of time cards in the system where we don't have any production order operations specified. So somebody's entered time against a production order without specifying an operation. It can happen in the manufacturing world. If the routing hasn't been set up properly and somebody needs to perform a task that wasn't on the original routing, they can still record time so that the guys on the shop floor aren't slowed down. But coming back into nav, we can execute a job that actually goes and tries to correct those missing operations automatically. When I'm in this particular role center, I have a few things I can do. So depending on your workflow, you may have people enter time, then you validate the overtime associated with those time cards, and then you send it back to the supervisors for approval. So the next step in that type of workflow would be actually calculating the overtime. And to do that, we use the payroll adjustment sheet. So if I click on that, we can see it starts up with a blank sheet, and we've got two options. We can get daily adjustments and weekly adjustments. So depending on how you've set up your payroll rules, you may pay overtime on a daily basis. For example, somebody works more than 8 hours a day, and you may pay overtime on a weekly basis. For example, somebody works more than 40 hours per week, regardless of how many hours they work per day. Almost any rule you can think of, we can set up within the system, and you can have multiple rules defined, which means that if I go to a specific TCM employee record, I can define what overtime rules apply to that particular user. And it's also combined with the shift pattern that's defined for that user. So you can define day shifts, night shifts, and things like that. and you can tie the payroll rules to a specific shift. So for example, night shift, they may get a shift premium. They may make $1 or $2 an hour more because they're working the night shift. So to calculate the overtime adjustments, what we'll do is we'll do get daily adjustments. And what that will do is it'll go to system, and it will identify all the adjustments to be made based on the rules that are being set up. And I'll show you the rules in a moment. So what it says is, for this particular employee on this date, we have an adjustment to overtime of 2 hours. So what that means is we're going to add 2 hours of overtime for that employee for that day. And right below it, based on the rules, we've said he's maxed out. We've said the maximum amount of overtime we pay is 2 hours before we start paying double time. Not the greatest rule, but it's a rule you can configure. And so what that does, it says on that day, we're going to pay him 2 hours of overtime and 7 hours of double time. And when we look at the adjustments that it's going to make, we set it up so that it actually reverses individual entries on the time card. So we can have it do a generic entry, or we can have it adjust the last work that was done for that day. So in this case, the last entry on that time card was time against this fixed asset. So it takes 2 hours of regular time, and this pay code here identifies regular time. That's a configurable pay code. You set up whatever codes you want. So it's going to take 2 hours of regular time off, and it's going to add 2 hours of overtime, okay, based on these pay codes. Similarly, with the next, and incidentally, I'll just scroll down here. So here's the 3 pay codes we have defined in the system. So on the next one, what it's doing is it's taking 7 hours, also off that last fixed asset entry, so that asset maintenance entry, and it's adding 6 hours of double time to that particular entry. Okay, and that's the basic adjustments. And you see the similar pattern. These 2 users or these 2 employees have the same rule associated with them, so it maxes out their overtime at 2 hours before it starts calculating double time. And here we can see on this particular one, instead of a fixed asset, it's actually doing a reversal on a specific production order and operation. So production order, 101004 with operation 30. The interesting thing about this is we have a setting within the setup that actually allows us to apply this cost of overtime directly to the production order. So in some cases that can be useful. So if it's engineer to order and you actually do want to record your actual labor against production orders, we're able to do that. We're able to record the overtime, double time, all of those sorts of things directly against that production order. Okay. All right, so that's the payroll adjustment. What we would do at this point is we would say accept all the ones that we were going to execute. We may not want to execute some of these. We may decide that we're not paying this guy double time or anything like that. But assuming you're okay with all the adjustments, you would accept them all, and you would carry out those adjustments, and it would make the appropriate entries on the cards. At that point, what we would do is then go to approval mode. So if your workflow is enter the time, generate overtime, then do the approvals, the next step would be actually to go in either through the web client or through the nav interface and do your approvals. Another option for doing those approvals is, or the sequence, is the shop floor personnel actually do their approvals to approve that just the raw time that went on the activities, and then payroll calculates the overtime after the raw time has been approved, and then it just goes through to payroll. Right? Now, once everything has been adjusted, so adjusted for overtime and everything else, the next step is to go in and periodically, so you may do it, during the day several times, or you may do it once per day, is to go in and we can see all of the entries in the system that have not been exported out to the payroll system yet. So the time collection module will capture all the time from the shop floor or from the field. It will calculate the overtime for you. It will do all of those sorts of things, but it doesn't actually do the payroll. So once we've got, all of our time calculations done and the the payroll calculations done and we're happy with it, what we do is we actually export that out to the payroll system. So that's fairly straightforward. If you're using the Serenic payroll, it goes straight to Serenic. If you're using ADP or Ceridian or something like that, it will generate a text file that can be imported. So when I hit export here, it comes up with a warning from Serenic for me that tells me that I've got an issue with one of the payroll controls, and there's a couple of warnings from Serenic that I've got issues in the way I've set up the Serenic payroll system. That's not a setup that we would worry about within the time collection module. That's a specific payroll setup. And then what I can do is I can go in and I can actually look at that time journal. So this time journal is actually the time journal from Serenic. So this is the payroll portion of the system. Not really the time collection model, but it is part of NAV. And you can see here where it's left as blank. This user, the configuration hasn't been set up properly, so they don't have all the data coming in appropriately for this particular user. They'd have to change that in the payroll setup to have it work. Generally, all the time that we've entered has been exported out to the payroll system for them to now start dealing with the payroll activities, like the earned pay, all of those different things that you'd worry about in the payroll system. You'll notice that we've got some weird numbers here as far as hours go. And the reason is some of those time cards, we had the time recorded in minutes and not hours. So you may want to record 5-minute bursts of activity. And when it converts it over to hours, obviously you're going to get decimal places. The easiest way around that is to always do things in even if you're doing time recording in minutes. So to do it, in 15-minute blocks, or of course the other way to do it is do it based on hours versus minutes. But at any rate, we've got it in the time journal now. It's in payroll's hands. They can set all the different payroll controls and those types of things that are required to actually process the payroll. At this point, they would post the time journal and then continue on with the payroll journal and all the processes that they would use within the Serenic payroll to actually pay the customers, to employees. All right, I'll give you a little overview of the setup that's available within the system. So if we go into the departments menu and we look at time collection module, we can see we've got a number of setup activities that we can perform here. One of them, I'll just jump into, first of all, the pay code definition. So, and this is what integrates us with the payroll system. We define the various pay codes, whether we actually want to export them to the payroll system or not. And the overtime factor is used if we're doing actual costs against production orders and jobs. So for example, if I've got it set up so that I'm going to record actual overtime against a production order, it'll use this factor to calculate the cost of that overtime for that labor. When we get into more of the employee side of things, we've got shift patterns. So you can go and define as many shift patterns as you like. And again, this helps out with planning attendance and also validating overtime if required. And fairly straightforward, you just specify your total working time and your start times for the day. On the activity side, we have the ability, as I mentioned, to record non-productive time and time against various other activities. So these are all configurable by the administrator. You can set up whatever work types or activity codes you want. And what it allows us to do is capture time at minimum against several different areas of it. So the first one, of course, is production orders. So we can record time against production orders. And by setting it up like this, when I scan a production order, it will bring in this particular activity type. However, if I scan a specific activity type like cleanup and then try and assign a production order to it, this will fail because I don't have any of these specified. Okay? Um, Similarly, on this particular activity, if I try to enter time against this activity without a production order specified, it will fail as well. So we can do production orders, jobs, fixed assets for the asset maintenance, and here is non-productive time. So in this case, if I'm on the shop floor, I scan this particular activity code, it will still record the time I'm working and treat it as standard time by default, unless there's overtime rules that apply to it. And it allows me to track everything that's happening in the shop floor, not just the time I spend on production orders or jobs. This is just a quick example. If I have people out in the field and they're doing travel, I can specify work types and I can specify alternate pay codes for travel time, things like that. In addition, if that travel time is going against a job, I can mark that travel time as billable or not. So I might have a code for billable travel and one for non-billable travel. Those types of things are possible. The last one here is just an illustration of how we can actually track, root cause of rework or extra effort that's put in on the shop floor. So, for example, if somebody is doing assembly of a component and it takes them twice as long to do it because the person before them drilled the holes in the wrong spot on the mounting brackets, for example, they could actually record that time under a different activity type, like rework for the drill press area. And that allows us to still record time against that production order, but now we can report on what caused us to take extra time on that production order. And over time, you might build up some information that tells you, most of the extra time you spend on the shop floor is due to engineering mistakes, and you can start analyzing the root cause of your overages. So those types of things are possible as well. It's not just a simple time collection module. They can do far more than that. Finally, I'll jump into the employees area. This is how we define a time collection employee. And what we can do here when we define an employee, and this is what we're tracking time against, we can set that mapping up to either an employee from within payroll, a resource. So this is great if you're using jobs because everything you want to do is on a job is typically billed by the resource. We can also set it up as a work center or machine center. And what that allows us to do is have time cards for unattended machines. So if you have robots or CNC machines that run largely unattended, we can create time cards for those work centers and machine centers and track the time, the runtime for those machines independent of the employee's labor time for those machines. Okay. Some of the other things that we set up here, whether this person is actually paid or not. So we can have people that are salaried personnel, and we don't actually export their time out to payroll because, they're managed just based on a salary rule where there's really no overtime or anything like that we need to worry about. We specify a shift pattern for that particular employee, and we specify the payroll rules that we're applying to them. So, for example, supervisors may have different rules than just a standard worker that just gets paid the regular overtime rules. So where we see this happening a lot is, especially if you have a unionized environment, you may have several different overtime and shift differential rules and supervisory role rules that apply to different employees based on union contracts. So you can set all of those up, and then on a per employee basis, assign those payroll configuration codes. Under activity code, this is for if you're doing manual data entry within NAV rather than through barcoding. We can set up some defaults, so the default activity code when they create a new line, what comes in, that sort of thing. And here on this director cost, we have a number of ways of specifying the cost of labor for a particular employee. So if we choose resource, there's a setting in the TCM setup that allows us to pull the cost from the resource instead of from here. And likewise, we can pull a cost from the work center and machine center instead of from here if we want. However, if we want to specify the unit cost here, we can do that, and that's yet another place where we can drive the cost of labor to the actual jobs and production orders. This last part here, we can create, we have the ability to track expenses through the time collection module. So users are able to create expense claims directly from their time card, drag and drop the receipts onto the expense claim, and then send that off for approval through the standard NAV document approval functionality. So that's a nice little addition for a time collection module to be able to actually record employee expenses for travel or things like that. Finally, this config number. This is for the shop floor client. We can define different configurations that decide whether we show the time card first, whether we show the dispatch list, whether we show jobs in the dispatch list, whether we show production orders in the dispatch list, and so on. There's a number of different parameters we can set that control the behavior of the shop floor client. That was the piece in the web browser based on this configuration. We could leave this blank, and using filters, it'll automatically choose the appropriate configuration for this employee. Finally, at the top here, we can specify who this user reports to, or this employee. So this particular employee reports to this Timothy here. So Timothy manages Mark is the way this works. So you can define a full organization chart by using manages and reports to, and there's actually an organization chart report that we can run that shows the hierarchy of your approvals and your organization. So some more detail as far as reports and things like that we can run for analysis and validation. So attendance verification and biweekly time reports and things like that allow us to analyze the payroll and analyze the work coming in. That's largely for how the time collection module works. If you have any questions, just contact DMS, and we'd be happy to answer anything more. Thanks a lot.